Well, today is Remembrance Day. Remembrance Day 2020. For many of us, a day we will remember because of the excitement last night as the Democratic Party in the United States won. A new president will come into office, and hopefully a period of civility, a period of politeness, a period of growth, and most importantly, a period where the COVID-19 epidemic will be considered to be the disaster that it is, and proper precautions will be taken. Even here in this country, we have to continually remind ourselves that it doesn't take much to get the numbers up again, and we have to work hard to keep them down. Remembrance Day, based on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th year, when the First World War was declared over. Coming up in the car today, I was listening to choral concert on CBC, and they had on a part of a production that has been done that takes the whole First World War into song and brings it to Remembrance Day. And the piece that they played was the piece, what they call the Piece of Peace. In other words, the actual war had been declared finished. And the commentator made a comment that I didn't know about, and that is that the officers in the trenches were notified at 8 o'clock in the morning that war would cease at 11 o'clock. They had 3 hours to prepare. And they were also told there would be no fraternizing with the enemy when the peace had been declared. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what would happen at 11:01 if a soldier stood up and was shot? Did that become murder at that point and not part of an action of war? And what was the difference? A minute? A minute? How soon we forget. I was fortunate growing up, and I've told you some of this before. That's the problem with having a person that's been around for a while. I lived in Scarborough at the time when Scarborough was just becoming a suburb of Toronto. Behind us was Eglinton Avenue, and beyond Eglinton Avenue was fields as far as you could see. Can you imagine? Fields as far as you could see. Fields that were in production. And on that street that we lived on called Adanac, which is Canada spelt backwards, every house was exactly the same. Stucco on the top, all bungalows, brick on the bottom, all sitting on a terrace. The only difference is one house was out, one house was back. One house was out, one house was back. You didn't want to come home if you had been drinking too much, because there wasn't a lot to determine the difference, except maybe the color of the door. Ours was bright red. But one of the things that had happened on that street was that one of the gentlemen about 6 houses up from us, who had served in the army, decided that he would set up a dart club. And every Friday night, a group of the men on the street would gather in his basement. And it looked much like, I'm sure, an English pub must have looked like. He had done a nice job at setting it up, and a whole series of dartboards. And they had a league going. And I was about 13 or 14, I guess, at that point. And when they were short one or two people, they would bring some of their sons in to play. So quite often I would go up on a Friday evening with my father there. and we would play darts. And they would talk. Now, in the group, there was my father, who was in the Air Force. There was a gentleman that lived next to us by the name of Bud. He flew bombers through the Burma Run, and they basically dropped supplies for the Canadian Armed Forces that were fighting in Burma. There was Mr. Allen, Bob Allen, who was the host. He was a courier in the armed forces, drove an Indian motorcycle, up through Italy during the Italy campaign. Always used to tell the story about the fact that he could remember going up this one road with a convoy, and all of a sudden it was being shot at by airplanes, and they all jumped out, and he jumped off his bike and he dived under the closest thing he could find for cover. And then when he crawled out afterwards, he realized it was an ammunition trailer behind one of the trucks. Worst thing he could have possibly done, but thank goodness he didn't get hit. We had a sailor, person from the Navy. He was on corvettes for the Canadian Armed Forces, looking for subs. We had one gentleman that flew for the RAF. He went over before Canada actually declared and joined the RAF and flew in the Battle of Britain. And he had a scar on his right arm where a machine gun bullet had come through the cockpit of his Spitfire and he was like this, I guess, at the time. It went right straight through. And I understand, although I never saw it, he had 2 scars on his thighs and the inside. But obviously it didn't affect anything that was important to him because he had 4 children. And to stand there and watch and play with these gentlemen as they swap stories, and I'm sure lies, about which force was better than the other and who saved the country and so on and so forth. There were a series of stories that I'm sure are now being lost. Our veterans are coming to an end, unfortunately, and with them, a series of stories we'll never hear. Shelley said that her family never talked about the war. And I think that was the case for many. They refused to talk about it. And when they did talk about it, it wasn't the terror of the war that bothered them. And of course, these were all people from the Second World War. It tended to be the fun things that happened to them. The things that were positive. The friendships that they had developed. On a Remembrance Day, they always spent some time talking about those that were friends that didn't come back. It was a powerful time. Now, how do we continue to remember? That's the question that we have. And the other question I always had was, when Barry was telling me about the rows and rows and rows of crosses, were those people ready to die? They died. But they didn't know it was their time. Was there any way? They were doing their duty. Were they ready? Are we ready? For me, it's personal this year because yesterday was the anniversary of my brother's death in Philadelphia. Now, he had some health problems, but he wasn't ready to die. He had a heart attack at work, and that was it. It was over. It was that quick. We all know stories like that. Are we ready to die? The gospel today is an interesting one because it's a story of 10 virgins. And unfortunately, you have to know some of the history of the Jewish faith to understand that what happens is the bridegroom or his family negotiates with the family of the bride, and they sign a contract. And that contract says that they will get married. It doesn't say when, it just says they will get married. And then the bridegroom goes away. And in the smaller villages, what would happen is that they would go back and they would build a house, a place to bring the bride. Now, most of them had jobs to do during the daytime. They had trades or merchants or worked in the fields. So they spent most of their evenings building their house. So this could be a few months, it could be a year, it could be 2 years before they were ready to go for the bride. Part of the tradition was that there was always 10 virgins that would meet the bridegroom, and they would have torches. And he would go in the early evening to get his bride. But no one knew exactly when. It was whenever he felt the house was ready. Now, if you take that story and you take a look at the parable that Jesus was talking about, the bridegroom is God. The virgins are us. Those that are ready, should be ready, to go when the bridegroom declares it's time to go. Now, in this case, 5 of them were and 5 of them weren't. The other tradition that happens is that once they get to the bride's home, they light their torches, and they light the torches at the bridegroom's home, go down through the village, pick up the bride, and then come back up to the compound of the groom's family, and they have a family dinner. And then afterwards, they throw the doors open to the compound, and everyone in the village is invited in for a banquet, a wedding banquet. And once everybody is in, to ensure that there is no problems, they close the doors. And the doors are closed. Now that's the story Jesus was telling his disciples. It was one that they would all know. It was one that they would understand. We would have some difficulty with it because it's not the usual story that you would expect. We don't understand the role of the virgin. But it was an important role in the marriage ceremony. Now the question then is this. 5 were ready. They had kept their oil. The torches they had would have been long sticks that would have been wrapped in reeds, and they would have dumped oil on it and lit them. They likely lasted for about 15 minutes, so you had to have more oil to be able to put on it and then keep the torches going. That's the importance of the oil. You needed something to remind you all the time that you were getting ready for something important. And you had to have it ready. Now, we have the tools. We have the Bible. We have worship. We have prayer. These are the fuel that would be used to prepare. Do we know when we're going to go? Not likely. If we end up being sick, chances are we have some idea that we're going to be ready to go in the next little while. But it could be sudden. You don't have to be old to go. We know that. Children die. Teenagers die. Young adults die. Were they ready? Hopefully. Hopefully. Because we have been told that the kingdom is available to all that believe in Jesus Christ. Now, I think the kingdom is open to all. And God decides whether you're ready or not. But for us that are Christians, we see the way to the kingdom through what Jesus taught us. I hope all those young men and women that are in fields in Europe, fields in the islands in the South Seas, those that died at sea, I hope they were ready. I know that God will accept them. I hope that we can remember them. As I say, we're coming to the end of a generation that were involved in that war. That is the Second World War. We've lost all those that fought in the First. So it's up to us to carry the torch, as John McCrae said. The torch will be yours, so hold it high. Hopefully we'll never give up this day of remembrance. And hopefully when we put our poppies away on the 11th hour of the 11th day of 2020, it won't be the end of thinking of those that fought for us until next year. Hopefully it'll be in our minds and in our hearts that the freedom that we have has been made possible by the lives of those that didn't come back, and by the lives that did. Lives that were changed so much that it was a terrible transition for them. For some, as Shelley told us, they couldn't talk about it. It just wasn't something that they could handle. They had locked it in their minds. But I can assure you they hadn't locked in their hearts those comrades that they had that didn't come back with them. They're there to remember. So it's up to us to carry the torch. In our everyday lives, to prepare ourselves the best we can to meet our Maker, and to remember that freedom comes, hopefully, in the next generation by peacemakers, not by sword. Because remember, 2 weeks ago we talked about the Beatitudes. And Jesus said, the peacemakers are the children of God. And we all want to be the child of God. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. And a reminder that when we do go, thanks for Jesus giving himself up to us, for us on the cross. We can sing today, Jesus is risen today. Number 190.